I'm Lisa Anderson, and I'm here with John Tulac, an international business attorney. We're going to talk a bit about the global economy and also how we can future-proof our manufacturing supply chain. And we'll talk about some of the countries and what to watch out for. So with that said, John, let's start with China. What's the latest on China, and what should we be thinking about when we're looking at our supply chains?
Well, China gives us something to think about virtually on a daily basis, and the interaction between China and the United States, both in terms of policy and what goes back and forth in the trade negotiations, and also the daily interactions that U.S. businesses have with their counterparts in China. So the most recent thing is a little bit of a breakthrough on the trade front with the Trump administration agreeing to postpone increases in some tariffs in exchange for China buying a lot more soybeans. So that relieves tension a little bit, but doesn't really address the substantive issues that are still dividing the two countries. And China didn't say when it was going to buy this massive amount of more soybeans. So this is a Band-Aid, but any little bit of progress is a good thing. That helps relieve tension.
Yeah, very, very, very true. What are you finding in terms of doing business in China today? Would you recommend that companies still look at, if they're not yet in China, should we be looking at China?
I don't think
and if
there's
they
any
are in
harm
China,
in
should we
looking.
be worried about this?
Right. Certainly no harm in looking, but I would think today it's more window shopping than anything else, unless the particular kind of expertise that you're looking for contract manufacture can't be found elsewhere. Then I would certainly be looking at other places besides China. Looking to Mexico. Mexico has a well-trained workforce, is technologically savvy, a lot of best practices in manufacturing. I would look at some of the rising stars in Asia, although the infrastructure in some countries isn't anywhere like China's yet. There's growing industrial capacity in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Those are all perhaps viable alternatives to China without all the baggage.
Right, all right. Well, speaking of which, the Chinese New Year will be here before we know it. My clients are starting to plan for it already, to have to bring in products ahead of time. Is there anything that you think we should be aware of these days in terms of, if we already have a supply chain in China and we can't switch it like quickly, what should we be thinking about or aware of?
That's a really good question, and I wish more companies would do what I'm going to suggest. And that is, you have to regularly test your supply chain, which means you need to go and visit regularly, break bread with your counterparts, tour the facility, and feel confident that everything is being done properly. When times get tough in China, what happens is the Chinese businessman will cut corners. And won't necessarily tell you that he's doing that, which means that the first impacts may appear to be minor, but you'll see quality control slip a little bit, or you will see delays in shipment that start to get bigger and bigger. It's just that they don't have a whole lot of other tools, and so they won't necessarily be candid with you about it either. So you have to go and check, even when you don't think anything is possibly going wrong. The other thing you have to check is, between your manufacturer and the port, and then what's going on in the port. How well is the manufacturer managing the logistics internally within China and also at the port. You also have to check, and of course they have to do this as well, but China can shift a regulation on you with little or no notice. And so something that's working really, really well, all of a sudden your goods don't leave port. And it's because some change in a regulation, or, and this is even worse in the current circumstances, they decide to hold something up because they want to send a message back to the United States. So it's caught up in the trade war. It's even worse with US companies sending goods into China. Your stuff can be sitting there in port, not cleared for weeks,
Wow.
just as a form of retaliation.
Wow. Well, so is there any way to know about change in regulations, or do you just have to plan to be resilient because anything could happen at any time?
Yeah, that's a good word, resilient, because some of it you get some notice, sometimes you get no notice, and it's just an arbitrary application of a non-existent rule that if you ask what's going on, they will cite some rule that just is there. And they used to really be much worse at this than today. A lot of that went away, but now we're seeing that kind of thing creeping back. Again, it's because of the trade dispute.
Yeah, that is tough. Now, how about if you have a partner or a resource that you send in to check on quality? Can we rely upon that, or do we need to show up in person?
I think there's a lot to be said for showing up yourself, not necessarily 6 times a year, unless there's good reason for it or you really like Chinese food or something. But if you're not going to do it yourself, then you need someone who absolutely will be loyal to you inside China. And remember, their idea about conflict of interest in Chinese business culture is very different than ours in some respects. So somebody who's an intermediary, someone that you hire to go and check on things for you, can very easily be persuaded,
right? Unfortunately,
to not see something or not do something, and that's a problem. So the true fixer type, the one who will stay hired and stay loyal to you, is relatively rare. Maybe 1 out of 50 of those who provide that service would be the ones I would say, yeah, you can trust them. And then of that 1 out of 50, maybe 1 out of 10 of those will be the ones who can solve problems for you, that don't just engage in process.
Right.
So finding that kind of person isn't easy, and then they're worth paying. They're worth paying extra because they're worth it.
For sure, and that doesn't sound terribly easy to do.
No. One other thing I want to mention with respect to testing your supply chain, and there's not much you can do about this other than to pay attention and be aware of the potential negative impact, is the South China Sea is a tense place these days. China is very aggressive militarily in terms of asserting its mythical rights in the South China Sea, and they've been hassling sometimes ships in transit across the South China Sea. And that's not just ships leaving China. They're not going to hassle ships leaving China. They will hassle ships transiting from other parts of Asia through the South China Sea. And so that is also part of your supply chain. And so perhaps trying to find out, which country might be targeted or which carrier might be more targeted is something that, as tensions heat up, is something that you have to look for. And there's not much you can do about it other than, hey, maybe it won't get here as fast.
Right.
So you have to be ready to see whether your inventory levels are really being kept strong enough here in the United States.
So some of my clients had problems last year with the pollution controls in China and them just shutting down factories. Is that still going on? And what's happening?
Yes, and I would expect that to continue. China knows it has a pollution problem, and unlike here in the United States, it can temporarily solve pollution problems by cutting off production or cutting off power or other resources on a temporary basis. And, the skies are polluted, the rivers are polluted, farmland that was once arable is not farmable today. It's a serious problem over there. In fact, it's an opportunity for U.S. companies that know how to remediate, because China is spending more and more money on addressing those problems.
Interesting. Huh. Okay. Well, it certainly sounds like you have to be prepared for disruption if you're going to do business in China, or if you're already doing business in China. It also sounds like you should be looking for a backup supplier.
Exactly. And I think that's true wherever you might be, especially if you're in a more volatile part of the world. And I don't think any company is in a good position if you're relying on a sole source of supply. And that means that sole source and everything in between can really cause you a lot of trouble if something disrupts
Well,
for a serious length of time.
true. And it sounds like you're saying a single source, but you may have a backup supplier, but if that supplier is also in China, single source country could be a problem too.
Right. Exactly. So when I talk about Plan B, it's always having an alternative available, not just necessarily in times of tough times emergency where force majeure type events or government events might interfere, but your supplier has a problem,
right,
for one reason or another. So what's your backup plan? Apple was widely ridiculed in the 90s for entering into a long-term supply contract for certain chips. And they paid a significantly higher price than the market at that time. Well, within 2 years, there was a serious shortage of those chips. But Apple had their chips and nobody else did.
yep.
That was a smart move at the time. So, having the ability to switch or to assure your supply is something that I think always should be on the boardroom agenda, at least on an annual basis.
Yeah,
Look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, who we're doing it with.
yeah, that's very true. It reminds me when I was vice president of operations for a manufacturer, the director of purchasing did the same. We had a supply base in Brazil that was the majority of what we used for one of our key materials. And then there was a problem with Brazil, and we were like, we did pay more, which created some havoc, certainly with our investors and board. But then basically we were the ones that were able to carry on because he had a backup supply in place that we had been paying extra to all along for when this situation occurred. So you're right. It's you look not smart until the risk occurs, and then you were brilliant.
Absolutely right. And I'm glad you mentioned Brazil, because Brazil is a total mess. It should be one of the richest countries in the world. And in fact, prior to the Second World War, it was. And then all the bad policy decisions, bad politics, bad business practices, increased regulation, all of that has just ruined Brazil. And of course, Argentina went through much the same thing, and it is still a mess today. In Brazil, you must always have a second or third supplier because something will screw up your relationship with a Brazilian supplier, or something will happen at the port that supplier can't get the goods out, but maybe another one can. It's just awful.
Well, is that because there's a lot of politics, or what's the cause behind this?
It's some of it's just bad business practices. Some of it is really bad politics, and frankly, mismanagement. Logistics in Brazil is always a challenge. Getting goods internally to the port, getting it out of port. The ports are really heavily congested, especially during harvest time for things like soybeans or sugar. Those ships get all the priority, and even so, they can be 45 deep waiting to come into port.
Wow, that's interesting. I can see that being a problem.
And if you're not a big buyer, you're an occasional buyer, you'll find yourself going to the end of the queue all the time. You don't get cleared to come in and load.
So it won't end up probably being worth it, because you'll end up adding a bunch of costs and disruptions along the way, or at least it sounds like it could create issues.
So they play favorites.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. So is there so speaking of Brazil, then, sounds like we should watch, be on the lookout for sure, have a backup supply, but would you recommend people actually look at Brazil for supply right now?
I think you can look at it, yeah, but I would be really, really careful, and I wouldn't think of relying on Brazil. at least not without two or three alternatives.
Right.
Maybe one inside Brazil and then one somewhere else.
Right.
And I don't mean down a little further south to Argentina, because that's just as bad.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like the challenge. So going back to China then for a second, I have one more question, and then I wanted to talk about some of the places people are going from China. So in China, how is the Chinese economy still struggling? I know the last time we talked, you said it was starting to struggle, which causes some of these issues to suddenly pop up.
Right. So it's struggling with a number of things. And I use that term struggle in relative terms, relative to where China was 10 years ago.
Okay.
Internally, it's struggling to maintain the growth rate that's necessary for the size of its population. And it's trying to manage a transition from a purely export-driven economy to one that serves its internal needs more.
Right.
And so the growth rate necessarily has to decline. Unfortunately, they don't have the tools to manage that transition as effectively as the United States did, although we screwed it up big time for a while as well. That was called the Great Depression.
Right.
But that was really at the time where we were at our absolute strongest in terms of exporting. And then we enacted the highest tariffs in the world, and the rest of the world retaliated, which perpetuated the Great Depression. Well, we had the luxury of much more time to make a transition. The Chinese are trying to do it in a much shorter time. And so they're still propping up the state-owned enterprises. They're still building infrastructure that they no longer need. So they're wasting a lot of money. And so they're trying to come to grips with that. They really have unrealistic expectations about what they can continue to do.
Right.
But if they don't manage something, they run the risk of creating a great deal of unrest. When you need to round up 100,000 people that are no longer employed in the big cities, they can do that, and they should literally send them off to the countryside. I'm sorry, you're not going to collect unemployment insurance for 6 months. If you don't have a job in a reasonable period of time, we're getting rid of you. We're going to. They used to shoot them. Now they just send them back to the rural areas where there's no work.
Right.
So all you're doing is moving the unrest from the cities where it can cause more trouble to the countryside where it's more easily managed.
Causes less trouble, yeah, I see.
And that's not something that's sustainable. So you have to continue to find ways to meaningfully employ that many people. And you're doing it with a population that's aging.
Right, because they have a limit on new babies, right?
Well, they don't have that limit anymore, but according to some of the actuarial analysis, it's too late. That China has put itself into this aging trap by its one-child policy, which now has been lifted, but you're going to have a very much smaller workforce trying to sustain an economy where you have twice as many people who are over 65. They're aging into that, and there's nothing they can do about that.
That is tough. That's going to be tough.
They're not going to import workers.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, from that point of view, then, yeah, I don't know. I wonder if the workers will migrate there, or it seems like at the moment people are moving supply to places like Vietnam.
Right. And so this creates opportunity for especially other Asian countries whose economies are still growing, now some of them very dynamically. Vietnam offers a lot of opportunity, but relative to China, it's quite small, and it still doesn't have the infrastructure built up to support a lot of the kinds of industry which in a few years I think it will be able to support. And Vietnam is aggressively seeking to attract new business. Thailand, to a lesser extent, Thailand has the ability to be very, very successful, again, once it builds up more infrastructure. Malaysia already has a lot of infrastructure in place and can do a lot. Indonesia, remember, that's a big country in terms of population. It doesn't look like it on the map,
right.
and it's spread out all over all these islands. But Indonesia has a very highly educated segment of the population, very, very successful businesses, friendly with the United States. A lot of Indonesian kids come to U.S. colleges to get training, just like Chinese students do.
Right.
But they have a lot more freedom, obviously. And that's someplace everybody forgets about Indonesia. Now, there's some political issues there. I mean, there is a negative component to Indonesia in terms of a faction that is kind of jihadist crazy, and they hate not only Americans, but everybody else from the West. So you have to be careful where you locate, and again, don't be visibly American. But Indonesia, a good place. The Philippines, despite the fact that they have a complete idiot running the country today. I mean, the guy is dangerous type.
Oh,
but we have good relations with the Philippines. There is a lot of infrastructure, especially on the main islands, and there's real opportunity there.
Well, so out of all the countries you just mentioned as potential alternatives to China, would you have a like one you think's most likely for success, or does it depend on the type of product?
I think it depends on the type of product, and it also depends a little bit about your tolerance for, I don't want to say risk, but risk is part of it. Your tolerance for putting up with some inconveniences. If you have a high-tech product, I would take it, even though the cost would be higher, I would take it to South Korea or to Taiwan. The other one that I didn't mention, and if you can put up with all of the inconveniences, and there are many, from bad infrastructure in some places, bad government in some places, but India
I was going to ask that.
offers an incredible opportunity. But it is very, very difficult to do business with India today still.
And is that because of the infrastructure or another reason?
Well, infrastructure can be lacking in some of the places. And even where infrastructure exists, just getting around a major city like Mumbai is a challenge. Right. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans go over there, eat the food, get really sick. And when they come back, they don't feel well for a while afterwards. Of course, there are ways of avoiding that, but even so, when you take all the precautions, sometimes it just doesn't agree with you.
Right.
I have one friend. He was with a big company, and he spent a lot of the time of the year in China and in India. He'd go to China, he could eat anything, and he was fine. He'd go to India, it didn't matter what he ate. He came home sick.
Really? Well, I guess it's one of the reasons why it's more challenging for now, anyway.
Right. And India has some serious internal infrastructure issues. Some of the cities are really short on water. And water is a problem not only in the cities, but also for farmers. Right. They have depleted the aquifers. And of course, a lot of the water that comes into India has the headwaters up in the Himalayas, some of which is in disputed territory with China.
Oh dear.
And, as Mark Twain said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting.
Right.
Sooner or later there'll be a border issue over, control of water, and that could be really dangerous.
Yeah. Wow. But it sounds like India could be another option for high tech anyway, since they have
right.
Really,
India graduates more engineers than anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
And India's universities and technical schools for training engineers are very good. They also train a lot of people in computer science and programming. So it is a great place to go to get those resources.
Right.
Just understand that there is such a big difference between Indian business culture, which is inefficient,
yeah.
and ours. So you just have to
You have
adapt.
to learn. Yeah.
You have to
Well, how
learn
about
how to do it.
export? Now that I'm thinking about it, export from the U.S. to any of these Asian countries, since we're still talking about them, is there any opportunity for that?
Oh yeah, a lot of upside, especially in terms of things which India, if it's going to really develop the way it should, it still needs a lot of high tech stuff. It still needs
Okay.
a lot of raw materials,
Hmm.
and I'm afraid it's going to need a lot more food.
Yeah, I
As
see.
the farmers are no longer able to farm, they're going to have to import food to sustain the size of population that they have. So yeah, lots of opportunities, I think, to export. There's also, just like in China, this growing middle class, and
Hmm.
American goods are considered to be luxury goods.
Right.
So exporting good consumer products, you don't have to be a product. You just need to have a good, solid product made in USA,
Right.
or at least a USA logo on it for that to be a marketable product in places like India and China today.
Huh. Yeah, very interesting. Well, I know 95% of the consumers are outside of the US, so certainly seems like there's opportunity, but I guess it depends on the countries and how
Right.
willing they are to
And
accept it.
that's the thing where you develop that systematically, especially if you've saturated your U.S. market. If you're not looking to export, then you're accepting a leveling off
Right.
until you come up with
Right.
some other whiz bang thing to sell to everybody.
That's right. That's right. Well, how about now turning our attention like back towards Central and South America? Uh, what what do you see there? Like, where are there places where we should avoid or we should be looking at for our supply chain? I guess we'll start with
Right.
imports and then export.
So I think you have to look naturally to Mexico. It's our neighbor. We are still under NAFTA. So Canada and Mexico are our easiest countries to do business with, and they are right next door. And there's great demand in both countries for our goods. There's also great ability to produce goods for bringing back into the United States.
Yeah.
So with Canada, just remember population is relatively small, and there's only so much that it can do. In
Right.
Mexico, population much bigger. You have Monterrey and Mexico City that are very, Guadalajara, very cosmopolitan, developed cities, lots of infrastructure. And, of course, the big concern is, well, it's not safe.
Right.
Well, look in your own neighborhood. There are places where you won't go near your own home.
That is true.
So it's the same thing in Mexico. There are places where you shouldn't go, whether you're a Mexican citizen or especially if you're not.
Right.
So you stay away from those places, and you stay where you belong, and you should be reasonably safe, as safe as you would be here. In fact, in some Mexican cities, I would feel much safer walking at night than, let's say, in south side of Chicago.
Well, yeah. Well, that would be scary. That is scary. Well, I mean, speaking of which, you hear all these stories about the kidnappings, and like in the last 10 years, it seems to have, well, I don't know if that's the right number, but around there, it seems to have gotten a lot worse because I used to travel quite a bit to Mexico for vacation and also some business. But it seems there's a lot more in the news, but it could just be that.
Right. And of course, it hasn't gone away, but it has gone way down in Brazil. I mean, it still happens in Rio, where if you're a wealthy looking person
Yeah.
and you're either a business person or a tourist, you do run a much greater risk of something happening to you there than somewhere else.
Hmm.
So, a couple simple rules. I always believe, don't be visibly American.
Yeah.
Don't wear a baseball cap,
Right.
especially backwards. you if you are wealthy, take sensible precautions. You want to stay at the finest hotels, fine, but then be very careful about your transportation. So that you have a reliable person taking you somewhere.
Right.
If you're going to a place where business people would go, then be careful about how you arrive and depart, because you could be watched. I go to Mexico regularly, and I will visit Pemex headquarters. Well,
Uh-huh.
I can get in through the VIP entrance because I'm scheduled and so on. I go in the front. I go through security. I look like a salesperson. I don't look like anybody. I'm really not anybody, compared to the size
Right,
of the
but
company. But
I see where your point is.
I'm there with a scheduled appointment with senior brass,
Right,
and so they can make it easy for me. I choose not to do that.
right, because you don't want
Again,
to stand out in a way that's
exactly.
unsafe.
And do you really need to stay at the best hotel every time? If you do, then be careful where you go when you're on your own.
Yeah.
Because again, that can make you a target. That's less so in Mexico City, where some of the finest hotels are all kind of next to each other, and it's like the Beverly Hills
Right,
area.
right.
Yeah, I don't feel unsafe around there at all, and I'll go walking. But in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, I would never do that.
Right.
Unless you're in the touristy area. I would never do that. You just, it's just a different set of risks in that environment. So you take sensible measures.
Now, are you seeing a lot of clients starting to look at coming back from China and Asia to like Mexico, since that's such, a close neighbor after all? And there is the Amazon effect these days where everybody wants everything quickly.
Right. And of course, that will help you get things faster if you're closer by. I think things have paused a little bit in Mexico because Obrador has proven that everything he said to get elected about being, at least neutral toward business, he just lied. And people in Mexico knew he was lying. But, nobody could coalesce around an electable alternative.
Right.
So you're dealing with a guy who in many ways is incompetent. And do I think that it'll go down the same path as a Venezuela? I sure hope not. There are more checks and balances in Mexico, but he has done a number of idiotic things since being elected, and I think that will give people pause about relocating production down there. Certainly in terms of foreign investment, I still think that in terms of engaging someone to do work for you down there, is still reasonably safe bet.
I see, but not necessarily investing new money. How long will he be? Like, I'm not sure how it works in Mexico. How long could he be in power?
It's a 6-year term, and he can't stand for re-election.
Oh boy, that's a long time.
It's a long time. So there's like 5 more years of him. I don't expect in the near term that things will get better, but if he makes things so significantly worse, I think he'll face serious pushback on the political and business fronts, where it might actually have an impact.
Right, I see.
We hope so, anyhow.
Right. Yeah, I hope so. How about like some of the other countries in Central America, like Costa Rica? I know that they have some business there. Or which ones would you look at?
Costa Rica has a friendly business climate. They're friendly to Americans. I would look there. It just doesn't have a whole lot of capacity.
Yeah.
So you're looking at making an investment down there, I think, for a lot of companies to make Costa Rica work. But it is a nice place to be. So
yeah.
So there's that. Honduras, wouldn't touch Honduras with a 10-foot pole. Guatemala has its problems. El Salvador has its problems. Panama is very business friendly. And as I would put Panama on an approved list. Plus, Panama has a lot of infrastructure, including, of course, the
ports,
canal.
or the canal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so Panama, Costa Rica, Mexico, but caveat of watching out for decisions made against businesses, perhaps.
Right.
How about, or go ahead, we're going to say something?
So Colombia.
Colombia, okay.
Yeah, we tend to think negatively about Colombia because of all of the drugs that came out of that. That hasn't entirely gone away, but it's been substantially reduced. The violence has been mostly eliminated. You have a peace that's holding with the rebels. And you've got a fair amount of infrastructure in Colombia, and that it also is close. It has good port facilities, so Colombia is a good choice, and it's got a business-friendly environment today.
Okay.
Ecuador loves Americans, but now they've got some political problems again, which makes it feel, especially if you were to go to Quito today.
Right.
I think I'll cancel my flight, and it's not as bad as Hong Kong,
right,
in terms of the protests yet. But I would expect that those protests will continue for a bit because the underlying problems haven't been addressed.
Right.
And so Ecuador, under other circumstances, would be favorable, but I would hold off right now. Peru never ever seems to get traction, but Peru today has a favorable business climate. Chile has a favorable business climate, but all of them have other weaknesses, some of which are structural, that make those a little dicier proposition.
Right, right. Well, how about Europe? How do things look in Europe currently?
Yeah, Europe's a mess. And I say that because there's some deep-seated problems that they haven't dealt with, where if you look at it and just set aside Brexit and all that hoo-ha for the moment, you have an economy which across the EU has been slowing for some time. You still have the powder keg of all of the refugees that are still trying to get in, while trying to assimilate a fairly large number of ones they've already taken in. And there are all kinds of issues associated with that. Germany is a perfect example of how you can be one of the highest cost producers in the world and still be a very effective exporter.
That is
which
true.
Is something that we should pay more attention to.
We should pay more attention. You're absolutely right. Because they absolutely are. I mean, I was going to say, Germany is still pretty strong, right?
Germany is still pretty strong, but all of the economies there are softening.
Yeah.
And a hard exit Brexit will just throw all of the EU into recession. And of course, England, the UK, it'll end up being England, Scotland, separate if they're not careful.
Yeah.
But the UK will be hammered even more. And it makes no sense. Brexit makes no sense to do a hard one without a plan. And there's no plan. There's still no plan.
No.
So we could spend a lot of time dealing with that. It's still an opportunity for U.S. companies.
Okay.
I think that U.S. companies should be looking to the U.K., start forging your own trade relationships, because especially if there is a deal or no deal,
right.
They're going to need to replace. And some of that stuff they're going to need to replace very, very fast. So a quick and nimble U.S. company might be able to at least bridge a gap for a while.
Okay. So it could be an opportunity.
Right. It can be an opportunity. And despite all of the bickering, and we have needlessly picked trade fights with the EU, we accuse them of doing all kinds of things that we don't like. Well, we're doing the exact same things back to them in agriculture. We just won the big victory finally from WTO about the Airbus, which has always been unfairly subsidized under the rules. So instead of saying, just stop doing this stuff, they say, well, okay, now you get to retaliate back in some other area. That's just ridiculous. I'm sorry. That's just ridiculous. And so it's just a never-ending thing about keeping up of who's getting hit with what today.
Right.
Wisconsin cheese always gets hit.
True. Well, and it seems like certainly Europe has good infrastructure, and but they just, like you said, if they're in a softening market, that's going to be problematic. And
so I think that I mean, they are our friends, but friends sometimes have disputes.
Yes.
The thing is, you just want to keep them from being out of hand. But I'm surprised actually that more U.S. companies don't take advantage of what are pretty liberal trade rules between the EU and the United States and make that work. in a whole lot more ways than we're currently doing. Companies
Yeah.
that are doing it are generally pretty happy about it.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, there's a manufacturer in the Inland Empire that has a, a location in Germany, and they seem to, do quite well, focusing on Europe as well. Strangely enough, they even work with Russia, which is another story. But
I'm not keen on doing business
no,
with the Russians.
I don't think that was that just happens to have been historically true, or they had customers there maybe.
Right.
So how about like Africa? Because that's in that side of the world.
Africa is really challenging for so many reasons. So many countries just have bad systems, bad politics, bad economic practices, little infrastructure, inadequate port facilities, and internal troubles. Some of it along religious lines, some along tribal lines, and so on. There's tremendous opportunity there, but at really, really high risks in most countries. And that's unfortunate, because if Africa could just kind of get its act collectively together, it would become an economic powerhouse. Some countries that have done better than others, like Ghana, have started to reap some of those benefits. But where you have a lot of progress, sometimes you also then, with a change of administration, you will see some backsliding, sometimes significant backsliding. Kenya was doing really, really well, and now Kenya's got some internal problems again. South Africa, all the promise that was realized for quite a while after apartheid was eliminated. Well, now we're seeing some really horribly bad politics, and the economy is suffering from it. So South Africa is no longer that safe bet anymore.
Wow.
And this is just, we can go through example after example.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we haven't run across too many opportunities that aren't ridden with risk, it seems.
Right. Plus, we're
maybe
going to be
Mexico.
Right. You're competing in in Africa as well, with the Indian companies that were there first and accepted some really high risk, but they actually, put their people on the ground. So families actually migrated, companies sent people, and they established permanent operations there. And then the Chinese came in and did the same thing. Well, both the Indians and the Chinese were often despised because business cultures were markedly different than the African business cultures. The Indians adapted better than the Chinese have. The Chinese,
that's interesting.
It feels like neocolonialism in some parts of Africa, if you're on the receiving end of some of those Chinese business practices, particularly in the agriculture sector.
Right.
So, there's no goodwill being built, but they are at least established there. So for a U.S. company to come in and try and compete, you're up against some competition.
Wow.
Some real established competition.
In terms of future-proofing your supply chain, sounds like actually, in listening to thinking through our conversation here, certainly you need to consider all the alternatives and evaluate the risks, but there might be something more to be said about looking in other places in the U.S. where you can find low-cost areas to manufacture in. It sounds like, actually.
That is so true, and that's something that is worth a whole conversation itself. One of the problems that we have in the United States today is that we have a shortage of potential employees in places where there's demand. And where are those employees? They're located in other parts of the country, and they're not moving today. Historically, when a factory closed and there's no work, you left town A and you went to town B. You moved on. And we're not seeing that today. There are a variety of reasons for it. Some of which is that we have a much stronger social floor to provide support. But the thing is that the kind of skilled workers,
Yeah.
Welders are in short supply.
Yeah.
Why are welders in short supply? Because we're not training any new welders.
Right.
Trade schools have been closed. Trade shops in high schools have been closed. Everybody's supposed to go to college. And so you have an aging set of skilled workers in certain areas where they have nobody young to train.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a problem.
That's not, I mean, seems like in a way an easier problem to solve. We should be thinking about how to solve this problem, given what we're discussing today. Although actually in California, they do we received the only grant west of the Mississippi to form the Int'l Center, which has some of those training for some of those skills. But to your point, there's a lot more needed, and California isn't well, Southern California is actually number one in manufacturing in the U.S., but there's plenty of places where there's manufacturing that have lower costs than California, to be sure.
Absolutely, and some of those areas would benefit so much from a new company showing up and setting up shop there. And it's like, okay, we can revitalize this economy, not all by ourselves and not all at once, but you're certainly going to lower your costs, just as call centers and back rooms moved out of California to places like North Dakota,
right?
Before they then went to the Philippines and India. You have so many places where you could revitalize a region by relocating. Arkansas, a number of years ago, attracted a lot of companies from California. They gave really strong tax and other incentives to relocate there. And Arkansas was a business-friendly state.
Yeah.
California is not a business-friendly state
no.
in a lot of ways.
Definitely cannot claim that.
So, and you more than others would see that because you're dealing with supply chains not only internationally but domestically. So you see where the strengths and weaknesses are in regional and smaller microeconomies. It's like, oh, I see opportunity over here.
Yeah. I think actually, given all the disruption we talked about today, there is actually plenty of opportunity for the U.S. to think about how it could maybe thrive in this situation, because one of the tricky things is that we have invested a lot of capital in China, as an example, over the years. But now that costs have largely become in alignment, look at total costs for non-commodity products. It's still a hardship, though, to invest that kind of capital somewhere else. You're not going to take it out of China. So perhaps like this, all this disruption will create that opportunity, I suppose.
I think that we need a new renaissance in manufacturing here in the United States. We still lead the world in terms of intellectual property development, and especially in the high-tech areas. Well, maybe we should be at least at the beginning, not looking at the lowest costs when we're introducing new high-tech, but making it here.
True, and actually that's another part of future-proofing your supply chain, because there is plenty of high-tech and automation, artificial intelligence that we can utilize today to be more efficient. So yeah, I think I wasn't actually intending to go there, but after the conversation we had, I think that I've always thought it was a good option to consider, but I think with all the disruption that we just talked about, we probably should be considering it even more.
I think it makes sense from a national security standpoint as well.
Yes.
Just the rare earths situation. China threatened to play that card, and we're totally unprepared for it. And that's inexcusable, particularly since China played that card 7 years ago. So when we read recently in the newspaper from some senior military official, no, we don't have a supply, we don't have a stockpile, we're totally unprepared. Where were you 7 years ago in terms of saying we shouldn't allow this to happen again? How is it that really smart people in positions where they can do something about it end up doing nothing, and then it's
Right.
the same thing over again.
No, you're right. We need to, I mean,
That makes no
you're
sense.
absolutely right. We need to encourage that investment for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point.
And what people don't understand is rare earths really aren't that rare. It's just that there are very few places where it's actually being produced because it's a major effort. It does cause pollution, side effects from the mining, and of course nobody wants it in their backyard today.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, our modern devices require these elements, and we can make them here. We can mine them here in the United States. We just need the political will to allow that to happen again.
Yeah. It certainly sounds like something we should consider. The last thing we need is national security issues on top of everything else. To your point.
And it's not just national security. It's all the stuff that we make and sell to ourselves.
Yeah.
We're making it overseas. We're using stuff that comes from elsewhere. We're bringing it here. Well, if the basic materials for that aren't there, but they are here, it seems to me the plan B is pretty obvious.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, with that said, John, what would you say, what would be like a couple of takeaways that we should wrap up our webinar with as far as the global picture stands?
Well, I think the key thing is always to stay informed, which means you have to know what's going on in the world, and you have to spend a little bit of time thinking about how does that affect me? Because we all have a little piece of that global economy, our own personal global economy. Whether it's as a consumer, well, okay, have to do without. But as a business, where is my stuff coming from, and how can that be negatively impacted? At least I think 2 or 3 times a year, you have to have that on the board agenda to think about, and you have somebody tasked with regularly keeping track of things so that you don't end up with an emergency.
I think actually you bring up a good point, because I have worked with several clients that see purchasing as somebody who fills like a role where they're looking at purchase price variance, but they're not thinking about sourcing and strategic, how important it could be from a strategic standpoint, especially if they're very dependent on other countries. So I think that's another, for sure, future-proofing your supply chain here from a recession or whatever else world events that could happen. So good point.
And I think having recently spoken about China to a number of small executive forum groups, the one thing I was impressed with is how well paired people were. But they're also ones who went out and invested the time, their personal time, for the company and the money to be in those forums and to consider those big picture issues.
Right.
So I know a lot of companies do that, but I still think that way too many get caught short because they're not thinking geopolitically. They are looking at the business side issues that they clearly see relate to their company. It's the bigger picture things that need to be integrated into the thinking too. That would be my other takeaway is there's every day the world is giving us signals both in terms of opportunity and risk.
It's true, and they sometimes are two sides of the same coin. So we need to be watching that and keeping an open eye. And it just makes me appreciate that director of purchasing. So I guess thanks to Bill Weber as well, because he did bring all these factors into consideration. And I thought, wow, I had no idea that you had to worry about so many things. So it gave me a new appreciation. But thanks for bringing that up, because our clients should definitely be staying informed or making sure that they have key people who are staying on top of the situation, so they don't end up. Some really bad things can happen. So it's really well worth it. So I think that's a good place to leave off. So John, if somebody wants to contact you, how should they do that?
Well, a couple of ways. My website has contact information, johntulac.com. I'm in Claremont, 414 Yale Avenue, Suite H in beautiful downtown Claremont. Telephone number is 909-445-1100. And the easy email is jwtulac just my initials and last name, Tulac, at gmail.com.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much, John, for doing this webinar. We've provided several interesting insights and takeaways for our clients today. So I look forward to an update in the future. So thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. Always a pleasure, Lisa.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.